This means that you all, as the voters, will be able to vote in each race, not just the district you live in. Audience members will not ask the candidates questions directly. Each one of you should have received an index card and pen as you walked in here tonight. If you need an index card, please raise your hand. Your index card is for you to submit questions for the candidates to answer. Please write one question per note card. Once you have filled out your note card, please raise your note card up into the air, and Gabe Hamilton will collect it from you and deliver it to me. We will then sort through all of your questions and choose several to ask the candidates. Please make certain that your question is a question that can be asked of all candidates. Questions directed towards a specific candidate only will not be asked. The forum will begin with each candidate giving a 90-second opening statement. The candidate order was determined randomly.
Once the candidates have been all given their opening statements, Lily and I will ask the candidates 4 prepared questions. After these 4 questions have been answered by all of the candidates, we'll ask questions that have been chosen from the audience. Each candidate will have 90 seconds to answer the question. They will receive a 15-second warning from the timekeeper. The candidate should quickly finalize their answer within these 15 seconds. The timekeeper will alert the candidates when time has expired. The candidate must hold their answer and allow the next candidate to begin his or her answer. Once all questions have been answered, each candidate will give a 90-second closing statement. That will conclude the forum. Now, we will begin with their opening statements. Mrs. Egan, if you would start first.
The timekeeper again, we heard you earlier. Hi everyone, my name is Karanta Ziegler, District D. I'm a Cougar Education Association endorsed candidate. I'm running for school board because I believe in the power of public education. For me, public education shaped my life. I grew up in a home with addiction, and it was the teachers, bus drivers, cafeteria workers that made a difference. And I want to make sure that our students receive that same level of care, that when they reflect back on their time in our district, they can be proud to be a PSD graduate. I have 3 kids in the district. I have a PhD in education, and I've spent 2 decades on student success. So that means helping students transition, stay in school as well as graduate. And I believe that a district has 3 strong pillars. One is shared leadership, that the decisions the board makes should not be solely based on the data in front of them or those who have access to the board. Secondly, future ready, making sure that the decisions we make today are thought about how they impact our district 5, 10 years from now. And I think lastly, safety and support for our students should be a layered approach, and it should include both social, emotional, as well as physical. Thank you all so much for being here, and I'm delighted to be here at the forum.
Hello, my name is Carla Bays, and I'm running for District C for PSD School Board Director. I'm here because I'm a mother of 2. I have a 6th grader and a junior in high school, and they are both thriving in Cougar School District. And so I aim to create that experience for every single child that's in the district. I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator at Odell Brewing Company. I have 20 years experience building community here in northern Colorado. And that looks like hosting town halls for important issues in our community like housing and access to clean water. I think that care for our community transfers well into our school district. And I'm a fierce defender of democracy. Democracy as a participant sport should be played into by everyone in our community. And so, public education is the very foundation of that. I'm a giant proponent, and I would like to protect it, fortify it, and make sure that every child in our district has access to safe, equitable, secular, and factual education. Thank you so much for having me here tonight.
Hello, my name is Sabrina Herrick. My inspiration to run is actually very personal to me. Back in May 2023, I learned that my daughter was one of 11 autistic children who had been abused by a bus employee in PSD. And after that situation happened, I just found myself wondering, how does something like this even happen? Tyler Snell, the bus employee, ended up being charged with 164 counts based on 3 months of footage. And I feel like that's a very reasonable question to have in a situation like that. So I started attending board meetings, and based on spending 2.5 years paying attention to what's going on in the boardroom, I built a campaign and decided to run. And so my major priorities are student safety, supports for our staff, especially making sure that they feel like they aren't being retaliated against when they try to advocate for themselves and for their students, and also transparency and making sure that we have forums where the community as a whole feels safe coming forward and bringing ideas to make our district better.
Thank you. We will now have our first question. Mrs. Bates, if you would start first. Answer only one of the following 2 questions. What is the top thing PSD is doing well that you would work to amplify as a board member? Or, what is the top thing PSD is doing poorly that you would work to address? Again, pick one thing, your choice.
I think that PSD is doing a good job of supporting their educators currently. I think that there is definitely room for improvement, but my experience from what I've seen in the elementary school that my children attended, the middle school that my son is at, and the high school that my daughter is at, it feels like their instructors feel like they have some autonomy in their classrooms, like they feel like they're part of the school community, and that they have some say in what's happening inside their classrooms, which I think is really important. Again, there's always room for improvement, but I do feel like our educators are able to build strong communities within the walls of their schools currently.
I'll go ahead and do the other question. So one of my biggest concerns over, watching the district for 2.5 years is I feel like district leadership has a tendency to focus so much on the positives that they gloss over some real issues that are going on in the district until it reaches the point of being a bottom fire. We see this, for example, with the consolidation that we were dealing with, where, when we finally talked about it, it was a question of either we close schools now or we get this mill levy. This could have been addressed sooner, it could have been worked on sooner, and it wasn't, and I feel like that's a very good example of that. I did also recently post a video of another example of a situation like that, where leadership just doesn't want to talk about the issue until it absolutely has to be addressed. And I would like to see a much more proactive stance by leadership, where we're addressing these things when it's a spark instead of waiting until it's something that just can't be ignored anymore.
Love that question. I think what I would say is that we have an overall good district, that we have performing schools. And I would say that because I know that folks have their preference for the schools that they want to attend, but overall we have a good district. And I say that because I come from a community where we definitely have those like high performing schools and then the ones that no one wants to go to. And I don't think that we have that in our district. I think it's a strong district. I think recently, I'm going to misquote, but it was like one of the top 10 districts in the state, if I'm correct. Okay. And so I think that's powerful, right? Not only do people feel that way in the community, but I think externally we are being recognized as such. And so I'd like to maintain that as well as with some improvements, because I think we can also do better.
All right, now for our second question. Colorado's Charter Schools Act was intended to offer laboratories for innovation in the state's public school sector. By objective measures and assessments, charter schools in northern Colorado have definitely shown significant success for their students. So, to what extent do you think the district should look to charter schools for proven strategies toward achieving PSD's goals of academic excellence, closing achievement gaps, improving teacher pay, or any other district-wide objectives you might have in mind? If charters do have a role, how will you work to bring about this engagement?
So this is something I'd actually really like to see a lot of work on. We're sitting under signs right now that show that Liberty High School has set several state records for SAT scores. One thing that I've heard from many families in PSD and at Liberty is that people are leaving PSD for Liberty due to poor outcomes in PSD in areas such as bullying, education outcomes, things like that. And one thing that I'd really like to see is for the families that are staying in their neighborhood schools to see those same outcomes that Liberty can brag about. So I think that we have a great opportunity here when we're in the same town working with this charter district that is getting these amazing scores to look at what the district, what Liberty is doing and try to emulate that as much as possible.
I'd like to broaden that conversation and make it less about charters and non-charters. And I really think it is about our educational environment within Larimer County. And so how do we achieve that perfectly? And I think that it's really, when we look at the parents, I'd like to ask more questions about our community. Because I think as a board or as a district, we could make assumptions on what folks may want, and it can be bad assumptions. And so for me, what I think leads to that outcomes or whatever is we really need to do some data. We need to get a baseline understanding of how the community feels and what our folks want. For myself, I think, I'll be honest with you all even now, I have a son right now who's a 5th grader, and we've been kind of toying, what does he do next, right? And it's a conversation that I think families need to have. So ultimately for me, it's not a district-only conversation. It has to be a community conversation, because otherwise it's very few perspectives and a limited understanding, and I don't believe we'll have the full picture.
I think that's a great question. I'd like to see a lot more inclusivity. I think that there's a lot of room for us to get together and learn from each other. I think that with schools like Liberty as a part of our district, even though you're a charter and our core knowledge school, there's a ton of takeaways that we can take to our neighborhood schools to bring them up to level with some of your extraordinary test scores, and to offer some of the amazing opportunities that you have for learning here. The tour tonight was amazing. It was so cool to learn what you all are learning within these walls. I think that there's a lot of crossover that we can have into our neighborhood schools. I also think that there's a bit of accountability that can happen there too, and that we can ensure that children across the district have access to schools like Liberty. I think that transportation becomes an issue. Access to after-school activities. We talked about maybe some lack of access to sports, where kids are getting separated from their core knowledge schools and having to go to their neighborhood schools and play sports. I think that there's a lot of room to be bringing kids more into an inclusive environment.
Thank you. Now for our third question. For Liberty Common School, our philosophy in education is underscored by the universal truth, and that truth is, it is the right and responsibility of parents to direct the education and upbringing of their children. Do you fully support this universal truth, and outside of the legal standard for physical abuse and neglect, do you believe it is ever appropriate for the school district to override the judgment of parents when it comes to the child's education?
It's always an interesting question on how parents should be involved and responsible for their kids' education. And I really truly believe that it is rooted in partnership and not control. I think that educators need to work with parents, and I think parents need to work with educators. I think by not doing so, we are neglecting the work that our teachers have done to get the degree to understand curriculum and pedagogy. we wouldn't have this conversation if a contractor was building a house. You wouldn't argue with that contractor and say, I know what's best. You would allow that contractor to use their expertise and their skills and what they've developed over time to build you a home. And so I believe the same thing applies to our education. That we respect our educators, we have conversations, but we also have opportunities for parents to be involved, talk to their teachers and principals, as well as being on a variety of district committees to shape and influence what's best for our children.
I feel like this question really sheds light on the fact that there is no one-size-fits-all education for our children. I do believe in family autonomy, but I also understand the major pressures that we endure in this climate, this current economic climate, particularly in northern Colorado, where housing is really expensive, groceries are really expensive. I think that there are a lot of pressures on our families that end up maybe not looking like neglect, because that's a very sort of black and white issue, but maybe folks aren't able to spend as much time with their kids as other families. And so these levels of parental and familial activity involving their children just isn't the same across the board. I think it's hard to make a call like that in black and white. I do think that I'm very grateful that we have some legislation that protects kids as far as their anonymity with counselors. I think it's important that kids feel really safe, and they spend a lot of time in school. They definitely need to feel safe within these institutions.
So I think the question of parents being involved in deciding curriculum got made slightly simpler this summer because we did have a court ruling saying that schools have to offer an opt-out on the basis of religious beliefs if a parent disagrees with something that's being taught, which even before I found out about that ruling, my opinion on it was, hey, I feel like opt-out is the way to go on stuff like this. Parents, as you were saying, have both the right and the responsibility to be involved in their children's upbringing, and I consider the word responsibility in there to be just as important as the word right. So to me, that means in the case of education, if there is a topic that a parent feels very strongly about, I consider it not only their right to opt out of that, but also their responsibility to take that step and work with the staff to find alternative curriculum for that student to be doing during that time period when they would have otherwise been learning about that topic.
Thank you. Just as a reminder to the audience, we will have, if you can hold up your note cards if you have questions, and then our card collector will collect them. Thank you.
Now for our fourth question. When Poudre School District asks voters to pass bond issues, that money is used for constructing new facilities, maintaining existing facilities, and other major capital costs. In 2016, the Poudre School District passed a resolution that it would not share any bond money from the 2016 bond with charter schools for facility improvements. Charter school parents pay taxes to finance these bonds, and we believe they deserve the real benefit for what they are paying. What is your position on whether charter schools should receive an equitable share of future bond money?
That is a great question too, and I don't have the time to thumb through my notes, but it is my understanding that there's a policy that has been created. I'm going to start over. So I think that charter schools should have access to bond money for schools built within the district or their district sanctioned charters, but I do think that they should be under the same oversight that our entire school district is under. So the policy that I was looking for is the one that requires our charter schools to register with the board of directors. So right now our charters can just register with CSI, the Colorado State Institute of Education, and then they can become charters without our board supervision or oversight. So I think that there needs to be some merging of oversight with how dollars are used when our public that pays taxes into those bonds also hires and votes for the governing body that is the school board.
So the specific bond measure that you referenced there, I was actually not living in the state at the time, so that particular situation is not one I'm super familiar with. But my understanding, for example, with the most recent mill levy that we had, is that some of the money from that mill levy is being allocated to charter schools. I seem to recall seeing that at some point at least, and I do support that. And you know, I know there's a lot of regulations in place, and when it comes to how PSD is interacting with charter schools, I do intend to follow the law when there are regulations in place for how money needs to be allocated.
Don't quote me. But it's my understanding that bonds differ from mill levy overrides. Now, bonds are made for new buildings, which may not necessarily, charters will not necessarily receive funds when it's a bond. But mill level overrides, there is a portion of that money that does come to charter schools. I can't remember the exact amount from the recent one, but it's millions. I remember it being that much. So money does come to charter. I think what we have to consider is how money shapes, right? Sometimes there's restricted funds, sometimes there's unrestricted funds, sometimes there's different allocations of funds. And so to me, it would be important to understand what are the rules and guidelines based on money, based on bonds and things and stuff like that, instead of a blanket statement that money should go to these schools or that school or another school. I think that's important. I also think it's important for us to expand our things around how we use money within a district, whether it goes to this school or that school or this school, and kind of think about how does the money flow through the district. Because again, if Poudre School District is not a good district, that impacts all of us. And one example I would use is an economic example. If businesses are trying to recruit new employees with families to the area, and our district is not a good district, that begins to impact all of us locally.
We will now start with our questions asked by the audience. Our first audience question is, do you consider student safety in the school environment a right or a privilege?
Funny enough, I was just answering an email about this last night because of the situation down in Jeffco where that issue is raised. I consider student and staff safety to be not just a right, but a bare minimum requirement by the district, and I consider it the responsibility of district leadership to do everything they can to ensure it through many factors, including making sure that staff have the training and management supports to make sure that issues are being handled when they bring them forward, ensuring that there is not retaliation going on when someone tries to advocate for themselves or for another staff member or student. And also, when it comes to situations like the shooting in Evergreen, which was what had raised the question in the first place, I think we need to be making sure that we're having somewhat public conversations. Obviously, we don't want to be like, hey, Rocky's evacuation plan is this. But, at least public conversation to the effect of, we have brought in experts to discuss how our current practices in the district are comparing to the best practices that people have come up with in the last couple of years, so that we can make updates and make sure that our students and staff are as safe as possible.
I'm just going to say ditto. I do believe that student safety is a right. And I agree with Sabrina that as a district we should do everything that we need to do to ensure our student safety. I was reviewing our safety protocols. We have quite a bit going on. But my question is, how often are we reviewing those protocols? is done on a biannual, annual basis. Also, I like to say that sometimes you can have stuff written down, but that does not mean it's implemented that way. So not only should we review our policies as they are written, we should also review our policies as they are being implemented to make certain that what's on paper translates to practice, and that our students are kept safe.
I agree with what both of my colleagues here have said, and I would go beyond it. I think that safety isn't a right, it's an imperative. We're entrusting our children to veritable strangers when we take them to their first day of kindergarten. We have to know that the district is doing everything in its power to keep our children safe and our educators. I think that we need solid policy that's efficiently enforced with consistency. And I think that consistency piece came to me being a parent. I know that if my kids get away with stuff, bad stuff keeps happening. So I think that we have a gap. We have a major gap in enforcement. I think that we need to understand as a community what we want happening in our school district. And we need to pressure us. If we're the next leaders, if we're joining the governance group, I'm all ears. I want to hear more. I want to know more. And I want to understand what best practices are in other districts too. I think there's a lot of listening that needs to happen.
Now for our second audience questions. As Americans, where do our natural rights come from, and how do you see your potential role as a board member upholding those rights?
Repeat the question, I heard like nothing.
Yes. There it is. As Americans, where do our natural rights come from, and how do you see your potential role as a board member upholding those rights?
You know, I believe that our rights is determined collectively. I believe that we all have different ways in which we live and we experience the world. I think we have to come together in dialogue. I really do believe in the principles of democracy and what that means. And I think when we come together and we dialogue across difference, that's where we find that sweet spot for human flourishing. And to where those rights are able to be achieved, those rights are being able to live, to be experienced. And so to me, it starts collectively. I don't believe things are top down. Just as I don't always want somebody making all the decisions for me, I'm sure you too don't want somebody making all the decisions for you. You want to have a voice in that. You want to have a say. You want your perspective to be communicated and heard, and also used to inform and influence whatever decisions or ways of being and living come about. And so to me, because I know that we all want that I believe that multiple voices should be part of that process to make sure that we have those rights.
I agree. And I would go on as far to say as we need all of our voices in the room. Democracy takes all of us. It's a participatory engagement for sure. I do believe that we all have the right to the pursuit of happiness. And I do believe that my happiness is tied to all of yours. That's where my empathy comes from, and I believe that that's what informs me as a decision maker, a critical thinker. I think that that's definitely what I live by.
So there's a lot to say on the topic of rights. I think I'll start by saying I know that, you know, there's some debate in some circles about the Bill of Rights versus the UN's Declaration of Human Rights. I personally am a huge fan of the UN's Declaration of Human Rights, and I agree with what they have to say there. And so that's where I start out on my opinion of that. When it comes to, you know, as a board member, first and foremost, I look at it as, you know, I'm looking at being an elected official, and I have a responsibility to make sure that the people of this community continue to have a say beyond just voting for me to be in office. I think that's a really important aspect of it. The fact that I'm here to represent the community doesn't mean that the community should feel like their job is done at that point. They should absolutely feel like they have space to come forward and talk to me about issues that they're facing so that these issues can be handled. And, you know, from the perspective of making sure the kids in my care taken care of, you know, that comes down to making sure I'm finding out where the issues are going on in the district so that we can better support students, and also partnering with other community members to make sure that our students' rights are being met.
For our next audience question. Last year, the Colorado State Board of Education voted to lower graduation standards by lowering the SAT math threshold required to graduate from 500 to 480. Do you agree with the State Board that lowering standards is the appropriate way to address graduation rates?
I don't know enough about this topic to have a well-informed answer, but my immediate response would be no. I think that we need to hold our students to a high standard and meet them there. Unfortunately, I'm not well versed, but that's where I land on it now. I definitely feel like it's something that I will look into more.
So I will say, when it comes to standardized testing, I very much recognize that not all students do well on standardized tests, and I think that is a factor that needs to be considered, where the more options we have for evaluating if students are ready to graduate and ready to go out into the world, the better. That said, I don't think that the right answer is lowering the standards that are required for graduation. You know, one thing that I've heard over and over, topic after topic, is that our schools are underfunded and we are unable to provide the supports for students to make sure that they're learning that are really needed. And so I think the better solution, rather than lowering standards, is let's get our schools funded so that these schools can actually teach our kids.
You know, I think in order, I'm like, I don't know, but I got an opinion. So I think what I would say is, one, I don't think that decision was made lightly. My assumption would be that there has been some longitudinal data that informed that decision. I would hope so. But secondly, I don't believe the lowering of those standards, for whatever reason they did it, is going to impact folks' ability to succeed within the district. I can give you an example. I have 3 children, and my youngest is a high achiever. Right now, he is he's 5th grade end of the year. He's done. But the thing is, he's still being challenged regardless of what those standards are. And so I believe that where challenge must exist, that challenge will exist. There's always been a level of differentiation and tiered support within our education system, and I think the lowering the standard just continues to allow for those practices and activities to take place. And as I say that, even my youngest son, what is his project he's working on this week? The life cycle of a pumpkin. Because we went to a pumpkin patch last week, and he was like, I'm doing a research project. And so I believe that that will still exist regardless of those standards. What I hear implied is that maybe folks won't work as hard. And I think that's where the district has a responsibility, is to make sure that the instructional practices and what we communicate to students keep those standards high.
Now for our next question. Governor Polis has consistently pushed for full funding of the Charter School Institute Equalization Fund. Do you support the governor's push for funding equity for schools chartered under the State Charter School Institute?
I think on that, I'm just going to say I'm not super familiar with the wording of that. I would like to learn more about it before I take a strong stance.
Yeah, I'm going to say the same. I think no matter what decision is made, we still need to learn more. And I also will say this, just because something is on paper or in law or written out, what's most important is implementation. And to me, sometimes I don't even know if we need a law or something written on paper. We could still do those things without something having to be passed by our governor. I think that sometimes we look to people to make those decisions, but to me, that's the conversation we can have whether or not that bill was passed, right? Or what we think about our charter schools. Again, to me, it's less about charter or not charter. It's what is the educational environment in our state, and how do we make sure that our students are getting what they need? And that's what's important to me. And as a board member, what's important to me is to support all of our schools, regardless if they're charter or non-charter, to make sure they have resources they need and to have conversations with both parents, staff, and administrators.
I think that knowing a little bit about Governor Polis's heart in education, that he really wants to make sure that there's access for every kid in Colorado. And I think his great focus was on immigrants. And so he really wanted kiddos that didn't have access to the language of their heart to be able to learn and be successful Coloradans. So I think that that's where that bill in funding charters probably stems from. But again, I wish I knew more about it. I will definitely educate myself more in that vein. Again, I side with Rhonda. I really think that we do need strong funding. We need to bring all of these kids into communion with each other in a community. This is their first opportunity to be a part of a community, and every kid needs to feel like they've got a shot and like they're a part of it.
So in other words,
We don't know.
but I appreciate that question. I definitely will take it up.
For our next question. When Liberty Common renewed its charter last year, some PSD board members stated incorrect things about the school and its application. Liberty administrators who were in attendance were not permitted to address these incorrect statements. Will you pledge to allow Liberty Common administrators to answer questions posed by board members at its next charter renewal?
I'm not going to comment on that because I have to understand that process more. I do think there's an opportunity to share. I do know that the board functions in certain ways when certain things are happening and taking place. And so I do honor those processes. And so I think that's important. And I say that just as much as I think whether it's Liberty or any other institution would want their processes honored. And so I think when we start making exceptions or pushing the boundaries, that sometimes can get us in trouble. So what I would say, I have to learn more, but I definitely want to honor the processes that we have in place.
For me, this is a context issue. I don't know what the questions were, and so I don't know why the school board wasn't able to address them. They may have not had information to answer. I don't understand. So I would just say though that I find it really important to the success of our district to bring all voices to the table and listen deeply.
So, funny enough, this is not the first time this concept has come up as a question, though it is the first time with Liberty for me. I've sat through several board meetings where I'm watching people figuratively stuff their ties in their mouth while the board is talking about a topic, clearly very frustrated with the fact that they can't engage with the board during that section of the meeting. And one thing I'd really like to see in general, not just with Liberty, but on many of these topics, is more of a roundtable approach where, Liberty, in the case of Liberty, and also the PEA and ACE, have an opportunity to come to the table and have that on-the-record conversation about topics that come up that affect them.
Now for our next question. Do you support hiring competent teachers who do not have a teaching certificate?
I believe that teachers are required to have a teaching certificate for a really good reason. I do believe that teachers should be held to a standard as created by boards of governments like the Colorado Department of Education and like the school board the school board directors of Hoover School District, under the tutelage of experts in their field. So I would say that I would have to understand the circumstances of which a person were hired without a certificate or were considered. But as far as I'm leaning, I would lean into the law of the certificate.
So I'm kind of in an interesting position on this question because my grandfather actually taught at a university level, but he was not allowed to teach at his local high school as a substitute teacher because he had a degree in science, but he didn't have a degree in teaching. And so I very much can understand where, you might want to bring in someone who's an expert in the field, but doesn't necessarily have a degree in teaching, because I grew up thinking that was such a funny idea that my grandpa was allowed to teach, at college, but not at the local high school. So I do think it's worth exploring ways that we can expand opportunities for people who are an expert in a field to maybe fast track getting a teaching certificate so that they can be brought in easier, I guess is a good way to put it.
I want to make sure that all of our students are given an equal and fair education. And so I believe that if our school district requires teachers to have a teaching license and education in certain things, then that is what teachers should have. Like, to me, it's very concerning to have someone in a classroom without those credentials. Like, it's one thing to know, you talk about pedagogy and things like that, but like all professions, we spend time learning our profession. And again, I'll go back to the examples from earlier. We don't want somebody that doesn't have an engineering degree doing engineering projects. So I'm very concerned how we can be okay with not wanting our teachers to be licensed. And so for me, it's a no. I think there needs to be some type of credentialing to make sure that our students are safe and they are getting the education that they need.
Before the next question, we would love to invite those in the audience to raise some questions if they have them once again. For our next audience question, when a current PSD board member steps down prior to the end of their term, the remaining board members appoint replacements. This tends to strengthen the current majority or makeup of the board. Do you have an idea for an alternate method?
This is something I hadn't considered before now, trying to come up with an alternative to that, but I definitely see the point with that, and that is something I definitely like to give some consideration to see if there are alternative methods. But off the top of my head, I feel like I don't have a good answer because it's not something I've given any consideration to.
I don't know if there needs to be an alternative method. I think very similar to us three right now who's running for school board. There's an entire application process open to the public. There is an interview process as part of that and some other criteria. So I wouldn't suggest anything different. I think who the board decides on is what's put in front of them. And I think to me, we do that every day in our jobs and our places of employment and stuff. So I respect and support the current process. And I think what we could at least do better is maybe make that process more transparent and more clear and communicate it more, and maybe have an intentional practice in terms of making sure we get a broad spectrum of applicants for that open seat. I think that would be a really great way. So it's not simply the people who might know about that process who's able to apply for that open seat, but it makes it more of a fair process, I think, when more people know.
I understand the fear for homogenization of the board in that regard, to have the city members vote for who fills an empty seat. But I do believe that that's the policy that we have in place, and and if we were to try to change that, we would need a ballot measure. And so that would be something that would have to be brought forth by our district community members in the regards of holding like a special election or something like that to change that process.
Okay, now for our next audience question. What is one book that you think all high school students should read?
Well, I would say A Tale of Two Cities. And I say that because I got asked recently what's one of my favorite books, and I just really think there's a lot of dynamic themes within that book. Don't be asking me to quote nothing right now. But it stays with me today, having read it in school, and so that's one of my favorites.
I could nerd out on this all day, but I would definitely say the book that I'm reading right now, that I still haven't finished. And the last time I mentioned it in the forum, I'm working my way through William Urey's Possible, and it is one of the best books I've ever read about how to deal with conflict resolution, and how to collaborate, and how to create best outcomes.
I feel like there's a lot of good options for this, but the first book that popped into my head was Ishmael by Daniel Quinn, so that's the one I'm going to go with. It's a great commentary on, the state of the modern world and how we ended up here, and there's great conversation in it about, how metaphor has come to be known as fact and things like that. And I think it's a great read, and it's a real eye-opener that I also happen to think is age appropriate for students to be reading.
We're super good at math and stuff.
For the next audience question. Schools always claim to be underfunded, with marijuana money still underfunded, mid-level levy passes still underfunded. What level of funding has to be reached for you to say schools are not underfunded?
$100% funding? That's truly it. It's hard to live in a community like this that is so affluent and caring and engaged and feel like our schools are underfunded. It's a conundrum in my brain that doesn't fit. And so, that's my simple answer. Sticking with it.
I think the best answer I have to this is when our students have access to all the extracurriculars and electives that will allow them to pursue their passions and also seek the scholarships that they are interested in. And when our students that have extra needs in addition to what the average student in gen ed might need, I will consider schools to be properly funded at that point.
I can give you an exact number. I would say $4 billion. The reason I would say that is that the state did an adequacy study. In order for Poudre School District to fully serve its students in funded schools, we would need $4 billion.
For our next audience question. Do you support merit-based pay for PSD employees, especially teachers, in light of this practice being effective in many industries?
As someone who's worked both as the so-called grunt worker and as a manager, I feel like I have a particular, two-way view on the importance of, having effective management. And the way I look at it, I don't consider merit-based pay to be entirely the best way to manage things, simply because if those staff don't have the tools that they need, especially considering, the underfunding that we've talked about a couple of times tonight, I feel like the staff can't do their job properly. And I think that's something that we need to take into account But at the same time, if we're going to be going the other direction with it, we need to make sure that first we have provided the supports for that staff member to make sure that they can do their job correctly.
I think if we're speaking to merit, that could be something I would consider, but if we're using merit as a proxy for performance-based pay, then I don't believe that that's what we should be doing, because we have to consider the multiple contexts that shape and influence our lives. Who knows? There may be a teacher who's struggling with cancer all year and is still showing up with those students. Might not be as great. Who knows what resources or things are available, as Sabrina was saying, that would shape that. So I think it's a variety of things. So when I consider merit, yeah, is somebody going above and beyond and being outstanding? I do believe that recognition matters. But to simply judge people based on their performance, I don't think that's fair. I think it's a larger ecosystem that shapes and influences the performance of our schools as well as our district.
I believe that we should be paying our educators and classified employees a dignified wage. And I think that we should be attracting real talent to our district as well. And so, all of our instructors should receive merit-based wage in a way. They should all be held to a certain standard that requires us to pay them a dignified wage that is not just, paying for housing and food, but also gives them opportunity for self-care so we don't have a lot of burnt out instructors as well. I believe our teachers union calls it bread and roses, which I think is a collective union term. But yes, so merit-based pay on its own, I don't believe has a place in public school, but I do think that to attract the right talent, we need a good wage.
For our next audience question. In your opinion, what should be PSD's approach to declining enrollment?
Such a good question. To me right now that question is broad. Because I guess I'm wondering what aspect of declining enrollment, but we take it for face value. I think there's a variety of things. For me, one, I think we need to communicate and conversate with the city and county and different issues, because if we think of it one just from a budget or financial issue, that's impacting us all. And so how do we get some unique solutions? So one example I might share that's come up is, we have buses within our district, but there's also a transport in town. And how do those two systems operate and work together? I think also enrollment, again, my future ready pillar, we have to think about the future. Declining enrollment right now might impact some of our schools, but we also know that we have folks who are in homes who have retired and want to downsize and are unable to because of the cost of living within our community. So if there's a shift in that shifts in terms of how enrollment and the declining enrollment impacts and shapes our district. So I think it's not an isolated thing. We can't make more babies. I mean, we can, but they're not going to be grown enough in order to help us with our problems. But we can think of creative and innovative solutions in terms of an ecosystem approach.
This is such a multifaceted issue. Again, we can't control birth rates, and we can't control the decline in migration to our area. We can't control things like school closures, and I know that that's a major issue on the top of a lot of folks' minds. But we also have to look to the future. I do believe that we've created a community that is extremely wonderful, for lack of a better term right now. And so I think that people will continue to move here. I do think that our future projections look good. In the next 4 years, it's expected that we will have more folks moving to Fort Collins and surrounding areas. And so I think that we really need to gather all of the information before we make decisions based on today's declining population.
I feel like I'm going to be repeating a lot of things here. There are, as everyone said so far, there are a lot of factors that we don't control. I think one of the first steps we really need to look at when it comes to declining enrollment is why are people choosing to leave PSD? Because those are things that to some degree we do have some control over. You know, if people are leaving because they got a job out of town, we don't control that, but if people are leaving the district over bad outcomes in the district, that is something that we can take steps to take care of so that people aren't continuing to have those same bad experiences and continue to leave the district. And I'd also like to see collaboration, with the city and the state when it comes to projects that can encourage people that are coming to town to move into areas where we do have under-enrolled schools, which, we can try and sell these schools as, hey, right now these have tiny classes. There's so few kids in these classes, your kid's gonna get so much attention. That's gonna help encourage people to move to that area, especially if we're working with the city to ensure that there is housing in that area that is affordable for people to move into.
For our next question. Like we discussed earlier, the scores behind you exemplify that the ideology and methodology of Liberty produce remarkable results with no need to increase funding or reinvent the wheel. Why wouldn't the district apply this exact blueprint to all schools and curriculums? And do you advocate the adoption of this at the district level so all kids have access to this educational opportunity?
I believe I would lean into that one-size-fits-all comment I made earlier. I don't think that exists. And I think that that's why there are different methodologies for teaching kids. I think that our school district at large needs to address issues that some kids would not fit into this mold at Liberty. I do think that it's a really aggressive educational platform, and I think it works wonders for some kiddos, especially kids in families that have a lot of family support. I think for a lot of kids in our district, school is a place to go when home is not a great place to be. And so they need extra support, and they need extra social emotional support. So I think that Liberty has a ton to offer in the way of things for us to learn from. I believe in the district being inclusive and bringing everyone to the table and learning how we can improve across the board. But I don't think that there's one way.
So during our tour earlier tonight, one of the things that we discussed is the size of Liberty High School's incoming freshman class versus the senior graduating class, and that's one of those things that I'd like to learn more about the factors on why students are coming in, like a certain number are coming in for freshman year but aren't necessarily staying to graduation, because I feel like that might actually be an indicator, what Carla was talking about here, that not every setup is the correct one for every student. I believe the numbers that you guys were telling me was an incoming graduation class of 110 versus a graduating class of 60-some. And to me, that says that we have a lot of students that are coming in here very excited about the programming, but maybe it isn't the right fit for them. And I feel like that is a very good example of why we need multiple options for types of schooling that students can have available to them, because the students that are graduating here, clearly it's working very well for them, but when that many students are choosing to go to a different setup, clearly that's also not the correct option for everyone.
I'm going to echo what my colleagues have said about it not being the perfect school for all students, and I want to say that choice matters. Choice matters in our district. Parents' choice into different schools. That in of itself suggests that a singular ideal of curriculum and pedagogy is not the path to go within our district. I think another thing that we have to consider too is, I don't care what the program or school is, as a board member, I want us to look more deeply at data. Not in the aggregate, but we should actually disaggregate our data to see who's benefiting. How do we look at it in terms of socioeconomic status? How do we look at it in terms of, schools? How do we look at it in terms of students' backgrounds and stuff? So I think we need to take a deeper dive. And again, sometimes students do well based simply on the home that they come from. And so I was bragging about my children earlier, their PSAT, my middle child. He took his PSAT and he scored a 1450. So those scores are not indicative only to Liberty. They exist across our district. And so I believe that we need to maintain that choice. We need to maintain that variety. And we also need to continue to support, uplift, and maintain the wonderful work that's happening here at Liberty.
Liberty Common Charter School holds itself to 6 keystone virtues. These are fortitude, prudence, justice, temperance, gratitude, and patriotism. Do you believe that schools at the PSD district should be held to similar, if not other virtues?
So my daughter's elementary school actually had a kind of similar concept. It was different virtues, but it was respect for self, respect for others, and respect for the world. And I think things like that, no matter what phrasing we go with or what the virtues are, I think these are great things that we should be instilling in our children. That, we need to be making good decisions. We need to be honoring others around us, celebrating others around us, and supporting each other.
I think that we should have conversations on what matters to our students. And I think that you're going to get a different story from each student. You're going to get a different story in each school. And so I believe that it should be the collective experience of that particular context. So what might exist in Liberty might look different than Booter High School. That's what school my kids attend. But I think it's a conversation of what's important to students, a conversation of what guides your behavior, a conversation of how do you go from where you are to where you want to become, and what are the multiple pathways to get there. And I think that however our students in our schools develop that, it's important, but I also don't think that is a singular view or perspective, because just as a school choice question, or just even as you all asked us what is our favorite book, I think that exists within our district too, and some students might find that they deeply connect with different ideas, and I want to honor that choice because I want them to continue to grow and be exactly who they are to be.
I would love to honor the individuality of our students as well, and I love a good inspiration. And so I have a child at Pooter also, and their motto is Ubuntu, which I believe Nelson Mandela really leaned into, and it is, I am because you are because we are. And so for me, that speaks volumes for that school and the community within those walls, and how those kids are upheld to a certain standard of treating each other, of treating themselves, and helping to create a community around them.
I don't know, it's okay. I can sing the song if you want to.
Thank you. That is all the time that we have for questions. Candidates will now make their closing statements.
I just first want to say thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you for this opportunity. I thought the questions were wonderful. It really challenged us to think more differently. And what I appreciated was the perspective of charters, right? And I think that always comes up in other spaces, so thank you. Most importantly to me is just stewarding funds, budgeting, supervision, student conduct. And I think those are the decisions that the board will have to shape and answer questions about, and have a long history of being able to do that work. And so I hope to bring that to support my students, my kids, students in districts, and also students, administrators, educators, and staff here at Liberty. So thank you, and I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here tonight and to talk to the families at Liberty and whoever's going to watch this YouTube video that you're putting out there into the world. I think that I bring something unique from Corona, should I be elected to the board, that is a really great balance. I think that I see our community in a really holistic way. I understand what our most vulnerable community members need and what their experience in Northern Colorado is like. And I bring a lot of heart and critical thinking to this space. So I hope that if you're still filling out your ballot, that you complete it in the next few days, get it in, and I promise I won't text you or knock on your door if you get it in early. Otherwise, you might see me this weekend. Thanks again for having me this evening.
Like everyone else said, thanks so much for your questions tonight. You had some really good ones tonight. I really appreciated them. As far as I go, I feel like I've demonstrated over the course of the last 2.5 years that I am here to see PSD become the best district that it can be and see them hold themselves accountable to the promises that they have been making to us for years. So a vote for me is a vote for the candidate who is not going to shut up until we get this right.
I'd like to thank the candidates for participating in the forum, our audience for attending the forum, our student panel for conducting the forum, and our amazing staff who helped set all of this up. I know many of you submitted questions that were not asked tonight, but you can contact the candidates directly with your questions if you would like them answered. Ballots for the 2025 election have already been mailed and must be returned by November 4th. We have recorded this candidate forum and will send out the link soon. And with that, the forum is concluded.